It is the night of July 20th, in the 1960s. Somewhere in America, a boy sits cross-legged on a soft carpet, close enough to a brand new color television to feel its warmth on his face. His father sits behind him with a drink in hand, already talking about the future, engineering school, maybe, or law. The room smells like dinner still cooking in the next room, unrushed. A few miles away, in a crowded apartment stacked 3 families deep, another boy stands on his toes, straining to see a small black and white screen borrowed from a neighbor. The volume is turned low so it will not wake a sleeping baby. His mother watches from the doorway, arms crossed, thinking not about the future, but about tomorrow's shift. At the exact same second, Neil Armstrong sets his boot on the surface of the moon. Both boys watch the same grainy image, both hear the same words about mankind and giant leaps. For one instant, the whole country seems to hold its breath together. But were they really watching the same moment? The 1960s are remembered as America's decade of possibility, rockets, revolutions, and a promise that anyone could become anything. And for millions, that promise felt true. But history rarely tells you what it felt like from inside 2 very different homes, because long before either boy could vote, work, or dream out loud, something invisible had already decided how far each dream was allowed to travel. Tonight, we are going to follow that invisible line, through the house, the classroom, the draft card, and finally, into the personality you carry with you right now. Long before a child learns what money is, they already understand the feeling of home. They know whether the air feels calm or tense. They know whether voices rise when the mail arrives. They know without anyone explaining it, whether the world inside these walls is something to trust. The rich kid's house teaches its first lesson in silence. There is a bedroom with a door that closes, a desk, a shelf of books nobody rushes him to finish, maybe a yard, maybe a room the family barely uses except when guests come over. Space becomes ordinary. Quiet becomes ordinary. And when quiet is ordinary, something remarkable happens, without the child even noticing. He begins to believe his own thoughts are worth having. A child who is rarely interrupted learns that his voice deserves the room it takes up. The poor kid's house teaches a different lesson, just as early. Maybe there is no door to close. Maybe homework happens at a kitchen table with the television on, a sibling crying, and a parent doing math in their head about which bill can wait another week. That child learns to notice everything: a sigh, an unopened envelope, the sound of a car that will not start. Their attention does not rest. They are not simply growing up. They are scanning. Psychologists have a name for what this kind of childhood does to the body. It is called allostatic load, the physical wear that chronic stress leaves behind, the cost of a nervous system that never fully powers down. This is not a metaphor. A child raised in constant financial tension is not just more anxious. Their body is quietly paying a bill of its own, one that compounds for years. And then there is the price of a mistake. A rich child who knocks over a lamp learns that mistakes are annoying. A poor child who does the same thing learns that mistakes are expensive. One version of a mistake becomes a story told at dinner years later. The other becomes a memory of a parent's face falling. Neither child chose this lesson, both absorbed it completely. But here is the question the story of the 1960s rarely asks out loud. Why were these 2 houses ever so different to begin with? The answer did not start with either family's effort. It started decades earlier, on a map. Throughout the 1930s and into the decades that followed, federal housing agencies quietly graded American neighborhoods by risk, a practice historians now call redlining. Neighborhoods where black and low-income families lived were marked in red and labeled hazardous, which meant banks routinely refused to issue home loans there, no matter how reliable the family applying actually was. Meanwhile, after World War II, the GI Bill offered veterans low-cost mortgages that helped build the American middle class almost overnight. But in practice, many black veterans were denied access to those same benefits by local banks and housing boards, even though the law itself did not name race directly. So when the rich kid's father bought a house with a stable loan and a rising value, and the poor kid's family was steered toward renting, or toward a neighborhood the banks had already written off, this was not simply two families making different choices. It was policy, quietly deciding in advance which children would inherit stability and which would inherit uncertainty, years before either child was even born. A house is never just a house. For a child, it is the first map of what the world is allowed to look like. And some children were handed maps already drawn with roads, streetlights, and open doors. Others were handed a map with entire streets missing, then told, later in life, to simply work harder to find their way. If the house was the first classroom of class, school was supposed to be the place where that classroom finally closed. That was the promise, at least. Public education, as the great equalizer, the one place where a child's background would stop mattering and their effort would finally start. It is a beautiful idea, but when the rich kid and the poor kid walked into the same building, they did not walk in carrying the same invisible backpack. The rich kid often arrived already fluent in a language nobody taught in class. He had been read to before kindergarten. He had watched adults debate politics over dinner, ask him what he thought, expect an answer. Without ever studying it, he had been rehearsing the language of confidence for years. Sociologists call this the hidden curriculum, the unwritten rules that decide who succeeds in a classroom long before any test is graded. How to ask a teacher for help without fear, how to speak up when you are unsure, how to assume, instinctively, that the adult in front of you is on your side. Picture two students given the exact same assignment. One raises a hand immediately, because asking questions has always been welcomed at home. The other stays silent, quietly convinced that a question will expose what they don't know. By the end of the semester, one is labeled engaged, the other is labeled distracted, maybe even slow. The difference was never ability, it was rehearsal. But the unfairness went far beyond behavior. It was built into the walls of the schools themselves. In America, public schools have long been funded, largely through local property taxes. That means a wealthy neighborhood, with higher home values, generates more tax revenue, and its schools get newer books, more teachers, better labs. A poorer neighborhood generates less, and its schools make do with less. It is a quiet, self-repeating loop. The same invisible policy that decided which families got home loans also decided, years later, which children got well-funded classrooms. The child never chose either outcome. The zip code chose it for them. Washington noticed, at least in part. In 1965, the federal government passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, sending funding specifically towards schools serving low-income students. That same era gave rise to Head Start, a program built to give children from struggling families an early academic foundation before kindergarten even began. These were real, deliberate attempts to close a gap that policymakers already understood existed. But a single federal program could not undo what decades of local funding had already carved into the system, and for the two children in our story, the gap remained wide enough to feel. And that gap was not only about resources, it was about expectation. One child was asked, again and again, which college do you want to go to? A question that assumed college as a matter of when, not if. The other was asked, what kind of job are you thinking about? A question that quietly assumed adulthood would arrive early, and that higher education was someone else's story. Expectations have a strange power over the human mind. Children tend to grow toward the future the adults around them already believe is theirs. When everyone assumes you belong in a lecture hall, that assumption becomes a kind of gravity, pulling you gently forward. When no one in your family has ever set foot in one, that same lecture hall can start to feel less like a destination and more like a foreign country. The greatest inequality in these schools, then, was rarely a difference in intelligence. It was a difference in whether a child walked in believing the building was built for someone like them, or spent every day quietly wondering if they had been let in by mistake. By the time these two boys became teenagers, they had heard the same sentence more times than they could count. Work hard, and you can become anything. It is one of the most famous promises in American life, and for many people, it has been true. But a promise is not experienced the same way by everyone who hears it. To the rich kid, those words sounded like an invitation. Go to college, try a career, and if it doesn't fit, try another. Travel first if you want. Failure, when it came, was treated as part of the process, a bruise, not a wound. When a family has savings behind them, a mistake becomes an expensive lesson instead of a permanent setback. The poor kid heard the exact same words: work hard, make something of yourself. But they landed differently, because before he could think about dreaming, he had to think about surviving. Maybe he was already working after school, and that paycheck wasn't for concert tickets. It was for groceries, or gas, or keeping the lights on. Every hour spent earning money was an hour he could not spend studying, or joining a club, or building the kind of record that impresses a college admissions officer. Nobody wrote that cost down anywhere, but it was real, and it added up. Psychologists have a term for what happens to the mind under this kind of pressure: scarcity mindset. When resources are tight, the brain doesn't become lazy or unambitious. It becomes narrow. It fixates on the nearest, loudest problem, because survival always outranks the future. A poor kid who seems to lack ambition is often not lacking ambition at all. He is simply running a mind that has been trained, out of necessity, to solve today before it is allowed to think about 10 years from now. And then, in this particular decade, the gap between these two futures became something far more literal than a metaphor. During the Vietnam War, the United States offered student deferments, meaning any young man enrolled full-time in college could legally postpone being drafted into military service. On paper, it was a neutral policy. In practice, it meant the rich kid, sitting in a lecture hall his family could afford, was shielded from the war simply by being there. The poor kid, unable to afford tuition, or needed at home to help support his family, had a far higher chance of receiving a draft notice in the mail. Two boys, raised under the same flag, taught the same anthem, and one of them was statistically far more likely to be sent to a jungle on the other side of the world because of something as simple as a tuition bill. This was not a difference in courage. It was a difference in zip code, translated into a matter of life and death. Beneath all of this sat a quieter, crueler idea, one hidden inside the American dream itself. If success comes from personal effort, then failure must too. For a kid with fewer resources, this logic turns inward fast. Instead of asking what stood in my way, he starts asking, what is wrong with me? That question has a name: the psychology of class shame, not embarrassment about having less, but a private suspicion that having less says something true about your worth. There is also a piece of this story rarely told at all: the story of the girls in these same families. In poorer households, daughters were often expected to grow up fastest of all, raising younger siblings, managing a home, postponing their own ambitions so a brother, or the whole family, could get by. In wealthier households, a daughter might be given the same permission a son was given: time to figure out who she wanted to become. Poverty did not just narrow the future, it often narrowed it unevenly, depending on whether you were the one expected to dream, or the one expected to hold everything together. Meanwhile, the rich kid was quietly handed something that never appeared on any report card: permission. Permission to explore. Permission to change his mind. Permission to spend his 20s figuring out who he was, while someone else covered the bill for that privilege. The poor kid rarely received that same permission. His childhood often ended the moment he was needed, and by the time both boys reached adulthood, they were not just different in what they owned, they were different in what they had been allowed to imagine. By the time these two boys become men, neither one thinks much about the house they grew up in, or the classroom, or the draft card that almost changed everything. They simply think, this is who I am, this is my personality. But what if some of the traits we call personality were never personality at all? What if they were survival strategies that simply forgot to leave? Take confidence. We tend to talk about it like a gift someone was born with. But confidence is rarely born. It is built, one small proof at a time, by a world that keeps telling a child, you are safe here, your voice matters. If something breaks, someone will help you fix it. Hear that enough times, and a person eventually stops asking whether they belong in the room. They just walk in. Now take the opposite. A child grows up learning that mistakes cost real money, that adults are tired more often than they are relaxed, that there is very little room for a wrong guess. That child learns to think before speaking, to hesitate before asking. Years later, someone might call him shy, reserved, lacking confidence. But look closer, and it isn't insecurity at all. It's adaptation. It's a mind that once had very good reasons to be careful, still running the same program long after the danger is gone. Psychologists describe this with a concept called locus of control, whether a person believes they are steering their own life or being steered by forces outside their control. A child raised in stability tends to develop what's called an internal locus of control. I make things happen. A child raised in constant uncertainty often develops the opposite. Things happen to me. Neither belief was chosen consciously. Both were absorbed, quietly, for years. And when effort keeps failing to change anything, when working harder never seems to fix the unstable ground beneath you, something else can take root. Psychologists call it learned helplessness, not laziness, not a lack of drive, but the very rational conclusion of a mind that tried and watched circumstances win anyway. What looks like giving up from the outside is often, from the inside, the memory of 100 times trying did not work. This shows up in how we treat authority too. Someone raised watching adults solve problems through calm conversation tends to walk into a manager's office assuming they'll be heard. Someone raised watching authority arrive as a landlord's knock or a collections letter learns something else entirely. That authority is something to brace for, not lean on. Even love gets translated differently. Someone raised with abundance might show love by giving time, advice, opportunities, the currency they always had plenty of. Someone raised with scarcity might show love by quietly sacrificing comfort, by carrying a burden without ever mentioning it. The gestures look nothing alike. The love underneath them can be exactly the same depth. This is why class is so often mistaken for character. Confidence gets mistaken for competence. Caution gets mistaken for weakness. And nobody stops to ask what built either one. None of this means a person is trapped by the house they grew up in. But it does mean that the things we're quickest to judge in ourselves, the hesitation, the guilt, the difficulty asking for more, might not be flaws at all. They might just be old lessons, still doing the only job they were ever trained to do, keep you safe in a world that, once, was not. It would be comforting to believe this story ended somewhere back in the 1960s, that it stayed behind with the black and white television sets and the draft cards and the redlined maps. But psychology doesn't work that way. Children grow up. The beliefs they carry grow up right along with them. The kid who learned the world was stable might now be the adult who negotiates his salary without flinching, who raises his hand in meetings, who assumes good things are still out there to find. The kid who learned that security could vanish overnight might now be the adult who saves every receipt out of habit, who feels a flicker of guilt spending money they've clearly earned, who apologizes before anyone has even asked anything of them. Neither of them is choosing these behaviors at random. They are following emotional maps drawn decades ago, by hands that are no longer even in the room. But here is the part worth holding on to. None of this is a life sentence. Human beings are remarkably capable of rewriting the scripts they were handed. People break cycles their parents couldn't. Families build new traditions on the ashes of old fear. But you cannot edit a script you don't know you're reading from. So before you can rewrite anything, you have to catch yourself mid-scene. Try asking yourself 3 questions the next time an old reaction shows up uninvited. First, is this response actually instinct, or is it a lesson I learned to survive something a long time ago? Second, if I had grown up in a different house, with a different level of stability, would I still react this way? Third, and maybe the hardest one, am I protecting myself right now from a danger that isn't even here anymore? These questions don't fix anything by themselves, but they do something judgment never could. They turn a moment of shame into a moment of understanding. Because behind almost every adult personality is a child who simply adapted to the only world they were given, not broken, not weak, just shaped. So maybe the deepest divide in the 1960s, and maybe in every decade since, was never really about money at all. It was about which children grew up believing the future already belonged to them. and which children grew up believing they had to earn permission just to imagine one. The most powerful inheritance isn't always cash, or a house, or a diploma. Sometimes it's simply a belief, passed down so quietly that you never noticed you were carrying it. If this video helped you see your own childhood, or someone else's, a little differently, hit subscribe. We dig into the hidden psychological forces shaping who we become every week, and there's a lot more worth uncovering together. And I'd love to hear from you. Where did you first notice this invisible divide in your own life? At home, at school, somewhere else entirely? Drop it in the comments. Your story might be exactly what helps someone else finally understand their own.